The room was empty when I opened my eyes. Not just quiet, empty. There was no hand holding mine, no familiar voice telling me I had made it through. There was only the steady beep of a machine and a folded envelope sitting on the bedside table with my name written on it in my husband's handwriting. I did not open it right away. I already knew what it was. I had spent 4 years learning how to read the silences in my marriage, and that envelope was the loudest silence I had ever seen. What I did not know, what I could not have guessed lying there in that hospital bed with surgical tape still across my chest, was that another envelope was already on its way to me. One I did not ask for. One that had been traveling toward me for 3 years. One that was about to make every person who had celebrated my lowest moment wish they had treated me very, very differently. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. If you woke up from surgery and the person who was supposed to love you had already walked out, what would you do next? Would you call them? Would you beg? Would you go quiet and try to hold the pieces together one more time? Or would you finally let the truth land where it belongs? Stay with Nadia on this one, because what happens next is not just about betrayal. It is about who you actually are when the people who were supposed to protect you stop pretending. My name is Nadia, I am 37 years old, and for 4 years I was married to a man who smiled at me in public and managed me in private. I did not see it clearly at first. Most people who are being managed do not. You just keep adjusting, keep making yourself smaller, keep telling yourself that the discomfort is love and that love sometimes feels like disappearing. I grew up in a small city in Ohio. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 6. She worked 2 jobs, kept the lights on, and never once made me feel like a burden. She passed away when I was 28, which was 2 years before I met my husband, Marcus. I think about that timing sometimes. I think about how differently things might have gone if she had been alive to watch him with me. My mother had eyes that could read a room in under 10 seconds. She would have seen something I spent years refusing to acknowledge. Marcus came from a family with old money and newer opinions about who deserved to be part of it. His parents, Raymond and Gloria, were the kind of people who smiled with their mouths only. They had a lake house in Vermont, a standing reservation at a restaurant in Boston that required 3 weeks' notice, and a very specific idea of what Marcus's wife should look like, sound like, and come from. I did not fit that idea. I knew it from the first dinner. I sat at their table in the nicest dress I owned, and Gloria spent the entire meal asking questions that were not actually questions. She would say things like, "Oh, so your mother was in retail?" with a small tilt of her head that made retail sound like a condition. I smiled and answered and helped clear the dishes and told Marcus on the drive home that his mother was interesting. He laughed. He said I was being generous. That should have been the first real signal, he knew. He just did not consider it his problem to fix. We got married on a Saturday in September. It was a small wedding because Marcus said he preferred intimate, and I agreed because I wanted to make him happy and because I did not have a large family to invite anyway. My closest friend, a woman named Delia who I had known since college, stood beside me. Marcus's side of the room was full. Mine had Delia, 2 cousins I barely knew, and 3 coworkers from the nonprofit where I managed community outreach programs. Looking back at the photos now, I can see something in my own face that I did not notice then. I looked grateful, not joyful, grateful, like someone who could not quite believe they had been chosen. The first year was not terrible, it was managed. Marcus was attentive in the ways he had decided attentiveness should look. He remembered my coffee order and forgot my opinions. He brought me flowers when he wanted peace and went cold when he wanted control. I kept cooking, kept supporting, kept making our shared apartment feel like a home while he climbed his way through a career in commercial real estate that he had walked into because his father knew the right people. I worked my nonprofit job, which paid significantly less than his salary, and I told myself that was fine because I cared about the work. I did care, but I also used the caring to avoid noticing that the financial imbalance had slowly become a power structure. By the second year, I had stopped mentioning my own career goals in conversation, not because Marcus told me to stop, because every time I brought them up, something in his expression shifted, not to anger, to mild disinterest, a slight refocusing of attention toward his phone. Oh. Are the television or the middle distance? It is remarkable how effectively someone can train you without ever raising their voice. I started to believe that my ambitions were smaller than his because he had never once confirmed that they were equal. I started to believe that I was lucky to be in the life we shared rather than understanding that I was building it largely on my own while he took the credit. His family reinforced this constantly. Gloria had a way of framing every conversation about Nadia in the third person even when I was sitting right there. She would say to Marcus, "Nadia must keep so busy with her little programs," and he would nod, and I would sit there quietly and wonder why I kept allowing my life to be described as little by someone who had never once asked me what I was actually doing. Raymond was quieter but sharper in a different way. He would ask Marcus about real estate trends and then turn to me with the kind of look that suggested he was waiting for me to confirm that I had nothing relevant to add. I always had something relevant to add. I just stopped adding it after a while. In the third year of our marriage, I started having symptoms I could not explain. fatigue that went deeper than tiredness, occasional chest pressure that I told myself was stress, shortness of breath that I quietly researched online and then talked myself out of worrying about. I was 35, I ate reasonably well, I exercised when I had time. The idea that something could be genuinely wrong with my heart felt like an overreaction, so I waited, I minimized, I kept going. In January of that year, I collapsed at work. I was standing in a meeting room presenting updated program data to our board when the room tilted sideways and I found myself on the floor looking up at the ceiling tiles with someone's hands pressed to my shoulders and a voice somewhere above me saying my name. The ambulance ride is blurry in my memory. The emergency room is a series of fragments. What is not blurry is the cardiologist's face when she came to tell me what they had found. A serious congenital heart valve defect that had gone undetected for years, that had been slowly worsening, and that required open heart surgery within the month if I wanted to avoid significantly worse outcomes. She was direct and kind and thorough. I sat in that hospital bed and listened and nodded, and then I called Marcus. He came to the hospital. He sat beside the bed and held my hand and said all the right things. He said we would get through this together. He said he would be there for every step. He said I should not worry about anything except getting better. I believed him. I think that is the part of this story that still catches me off guard when I let myself think about it. I truly believed him, not naively, not blindly. I believed him because I had spent 3 years finding ways to explain away his smallness, and I was very good at it by then. When someone is skilled at explaining away bad behavior, they can look a person in the eye during a genuine crisis and see sincerity that is not there. The surgery was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in February. I arranged everything practical on my own because arranging things was what I did. I handled the insurance paperwork, the pre-op appointments, the careful handoff of my project responsibilities at work. I told my supervisor honestly what was happening and she was warm and immediate and told me my job would be waiting for me. I packed a small hospital bag. I wrote down every question I had for the surgical team. I sent Delia a voice message telling her the date and asking her to check in on me after. She cried on the phone and said she would be on the first train from Philadelphia if I needed her. Marcus came with me to the hospital that morning. He helped me check in. He sat with me in the pre-op waiting area and he held my hand and he said again that he would be right there. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia was his hand on mine and the thought that everything was going to be all right. That thought was one of the most expensive ones I have ever had. I woke up in the ICU. The surgery had taken just over 7 hours and had gone as well as these things can go. My chest felt like something very heavy had been placed on top of it and then removed and then placed back again. Breathing hurt, existing hurt, but I was alive. The nurse who checked on me was efficient and gentle and told me the time and the date and that my vitals were stable. She said I had done well. I asked about my husband. She hesitated for just a moment. Just a fraction. The kind of pause that a very polished professional uses to decide what to say. She told me she would check and she left, and she came back a few minutes later and said that visiting hours would begin shortly and that I should try to rest. He was not there. I understood this in stages, the way you understand something you do not want to understand. An hour passed, then two, then visiting hours began and a nurse's aide brought me some water and I asked again very quietly whether anyone had been waiting. She checked a list, she shook her head. The envelope was on my bedside table when they moved me out of the ICU and into a recovery room that evening. I do not know when it had been placed there. Marcus must have come at some point briefly while I was still unconscious. He had left an envelope instead of waiting for me to open my eyes. The envelope contained a single folded document and a short handwritten note. The document was from a family law attorney. It was a petition for divorce. The note said, and I will remember the exact words of this for the rest of my life, "I am sorry, Nadia. This was already decided before the surgery. I did not want to make it harder, but I also could not wait. I hope you recover fully." That was all. That was 3 years of my life folded into 9 sentences. I did not cry right away. I think the anesthesia was still in my system and my body had a hierarchy of problems to process, and emotional devastation was somewhere below surgical recovery in that hierarchy. I read the note twice. I folded it back. I placed it on the table. And then I pressed the call button and asked for more water and stared at the ceiling and thought about absolutely nothing for a very long time. Delia came the next morning. She had taken the train without telling me, knowing before I did that something was wrong. She walked in carrying coffee she could not bring past the door and a determination that filled the room more effectively than any visitor I have ever had. I showed her the envelope. She read it twice the same way I had. Then she set it down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before and said, "Okay, here is what is going to happen. You are going to recover from this surgery, and then we are going to figure everything else out, in that exact order." I cannot explain what it meant to have one person show up with that kind of certainty. I held onto it like a physical thing. The next 3 days were medically focused and emotionally suspended. I worked with the surgical team, did everything they told me to do, slept when my body demanded sleep, and ate the soft hospital food and drank the water and answered the doctor's questions. I did not call Marcus. He did not call me. The divorce petition sat in my bag unacknowledged like a bill you know you have to deal with and cannot yet face. On the fourth day after surgery, something happened that I was not expecting. A man came to my room in the early afternoon. He was perhaps 60 years old with silver hair and the kind of careful, unhurried manner that belongs to someone who has practiced being steady in difficult rooms. He wore a dark jacket and carried a soft leather briefcase, and he asked the nurse at the door if he could speak with Nadia, and he used my full last name, which at the time was still Marcus's last name, and then he paused and said, or perhaps the name she was born with, Nadia Voss. I had not used that name in 3 years. I had not heard anyone say it in a very long time. The nurse looked at me and I nodded, and he came in and introduced himself as Charles Whitmore, an estate and probate attorney from Boston. He sat down in the chair beside my bed and he placed his briefcase on his knees, and he said the following sentence, which I have since replayed in my mind more times than I can count. Ms. Voss, I have been looking for you for approximately 3 years. I am very sorry it took this long, and I am deeply sorry to be coming to you at a moment like this. But I am afraid the matter can no longer wait. I stared at him. I said very simply, what matter? And that was the moment everything I thought I knew about my own life began to rearrange itself. Charles Whitmore represented an estate, the estate of a man named Edward Hargrove, who had passed away 14 months earlier in Boston at the age of 79. Edward Hargrove had been a private figure, a man who had built modest but significant wealth through several decades of careful commercial property investment in New England. He had never been famous, he had never been publicly notable, but he had been, according to Charles Whitmore, my biological grandfather. I want to pause here and explain what I knew about my father because it is necessary for this to make sense. My father's name, at least the name my mother had given me, was Daniel Voss. He had left when I was 6. My mother did not speak about him often, and when she did, it was in short, careful sentences that answered only the surface of any question I asked. I knew he was from the Northeast. I knew my mother had met him briefly during a period of her life she described simply as complicated. I knew he had not been part of my life by choice, specifically his choice, and that my mother had raised me under her own surname rather tha. And what I did not know, what she had either not known herself or had chosen not to tell me, was that Daniel Voss had a father. And that father had spent the last years of his life trying to find the granddaughter he had never met. Charles spread several documents across the small table beside my hospital bed. He spoke carefully and clearly, the way someone speaks when they understand that a person is receiving life-altering information while physically recovering from surgery and emotionally processing abandonment. He told me that Edward Hargrove had been estranged from his son Daniel for decades. That when Daniel had died in a car accident 8 years ago, Edward had become aware, through a letter his son had left behind, that Daniel had a daughter. That Edward had hired investigators and attorneys to locate me. That the search had been complicated by my mother's passing, by name discrepancies, and by the fact that when Marcus and I married, I had taken his last name and moved to a different city. That Edward had passed away before the search concluded, but that he had updated his will. That his will named me, specifically and unambiguously, as his primary heir. The estate was valued at approximately $1.4 million. It included several investment properties, a significant savings portfolio, and a private home in the Boston area. The $400,000 Charles had referenced in our preliminary call that I had missed, he explained, was a liquid portion that had been set aside specifically and immediately for the heir once located, structured so it could be accessed quickly without waiting for the full probate process to conclude. Edward Hargrove had apparently understood, or hoped, that his missing granddaughter might need something immediately upon being found. I lay in that hospital bed with surgical tape across my chest and divorce papers in my bag, and I listened to all of this. And I felt something I have since struggled to name accurately. It was not happiness, it was not relief, it was something closer to vertigo, the kind of feeling you get when the ground you have been standing on suddenly turns out to be a different ground than you thought. All of the coordinates shift at once. You are standing in the same place, but you are standing in a completely different place. I asked Charles one question before anything else. I asked him whether any of this was going to turn out to be a mistake. He understood what I meant. He said he had triple verified every document, every lineage connection, every legal confirmation, and that he was as certain as he had ever been in 30 years of estate law that I was exactly who the will intended. Then he said something I appreciated more than he probably knew. He said, "You do not need to make any decisions today. You have just had major surgery. My job right now is simply to tell you the truth and let you process it on your own terms." I asked him to come back in 2 days. He said, of course. In those 2 days, I told only Delia. I showed her the documents. She read every page twice. Then she set them down on the hospital blanket and looked at me for a long moment and said, "Well, now isn't that something?" And then she started to cry, which made me cry, which the nurses told us later was probably too much excitement for a cardiac recovery patient, and we both apologized and then cried again quietly. The thing about receiving unexpected information is that it does not arrive cleanly. It arrives tangled up in everything else that is happening, and what was happening to me at the same time was a marriage ending. The divorce petition was real, Marcus had been real, the years of being managed and minimized and kept at a pleasant but unbreachable distance were real, the empty room when I woke up from surgery was real, and those things did not stop being real because an inheritance had arrived. They sat alongside it in a way that made the inheritance feel both larger and more complicated than it would have been under different circumstances. On the sixth day after surgery, Marcus called. It was the first contact he had made since leaving the envelope. I answered because I had made the decision to hear him out with clear ears and no desperation. He asked how I was feeling. I said I was recovering. He said he was glad. Then he said that he had been thinking about the divorce and that he wanted to discuss terms and that he hoped we could do this in a way that was civil and fair and without too much conflict. He sounded careful and rehearsed. He sounded like someone who had decided on the language in advance. I said very little. I said I had my own attorney and that we should work through them. He said of course and that he expected nothing less and that he was sorry again for the timing. I said I knew. Then I ended the call. What Marcus did not know and what I did not tell him was that my own attorney now included Charles Whitmore, who had referred me to an Excel and family law partner in his firm for the divorce proceedings, and that my financial situation had changed in ways that would significantly affect the conversation about what civil and fair actually meant. The story of what happened when Marcus and his family found out about the inheritance is a story about exposure, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind where people reveal exactly who they are simply because the circumstances around them have shifted and they have not had time to adjust their performance. It started with Gloria. I was home from the hospital, staying at Delia's apartment while my own housing situation was sorted as part of the separation, when Marcus's mother called me on a Tuesday morning about 3 weeks after I had been discharged. I knew the moment I saw her name on my screen that something had reached her. I answered. She opened with warmth that I had not heard from her in years. She said she had heard I was recovering well and that she was so glad and that she had always cared for me deeply and that she hoped I knew that. I said thank you. She said she had also heard some news and she wanted to reach out personally because she thought family should be honest with each other. I waited. She said she understood I had come into some money through a family connection and that she just wanted to say that she hoped I would handle it wisely and that Marcus would of course be supportive of whatever was best for both of us. She said both of us, as if there was still an us, as if the envelope in the hospital had not happened. I told her very kindly that I appreciated her call and that my attorney would be handling all financial matters going forward and that I was sure Marcus's attorney would keep him appropriately informed. Then I said I needed to rest and ended the call. Delia, who had been sitting across the kitchen table listening to my end of the conversation, handed me a cup of tea and said, "She called fast." I said, "They always do." Marcus's family had apparently learned about the inheritance through a mutual acquaintance who worked in Boston's legal community and had recognized Charles Whitmore's name in a way that started a trail of conversations that eventually reached Raymond. This is the kind of thing that happens in connected circles. Privacy is not always as protected as you hope, but in this case, the leak had a clarifying effect. It showed me exactly how quickly people recalculate. Within a week, Raymond himself had called. He was more direct than Gloria. He said he wanted to discuss the situation with Marcus in a way that protected everyone's interests. He said that as a family they had always looked out for Nadia, which was so far from my experience of his family that I had to physically turn away from Delia's kitchen window to stop myself from saying something I would regret. I said I would have my attorney reach out. He said that seemed overly formal for a family conversation. I said I hoped he understood that I was still recovering from heart surgery and that I needed to keep my stress to a minimum. He paused. He said, of course. He said he hoped we could still be close despite everything. I said I hoped so too and meant none of it. The divorce proceedings were less dramatic than I had expected, which I think is because Marcus had clearly been advised by his attorney that the timing of the filing, specifically that he had filed while I was unconscious in surgery, was not going to look favorable to any judge who heard the case. My attorney, a focused and unflappable woman named Margaret, made it very clear in our early meetings that she intended to make the full timeline available to the court and that she was prepared to litigate thoroughly if needed. Marcus's side moved towards settlement relatively quickly after that. I think they had hoped that I would be in a weaker position financially and emotionally and that they could negotiate terms that leaned heavily in their favor. The inheritance changed the equation significantly. I no longer needed to accept terms that were less than equitable. I no longer needed to worry about how to pay my rent while negotiating. Margaret was thorough and calm, and she protected me in ways I had not known I needed protecting. The settlement that was eventually reached was fair. I will not say it was everything I deserved because I am not sure that is something a legal document can ever give you, but it was genuinely fair. The marital assets were divided equitably. The inheritance, because it had come to me through family lineage and not through the marriage, was protected. What Marcus had hoped to walk away from the marriage with was significantly less than he had apparently calculated. I know this because Delia, who is excellent at reading situations, told me that the look on Marcus's attorney's face at the final mediation session suggested that someone had done math incorrectly somewhere in the planning stages. While this was happening, I was also doing something else. I was learning about Edward Hargrove. Charles gave me access to the personal materials his estate had kept, not the legal documents but the human ones. Boxes of photographs, journals, letters, a lifetime of careful private record keeping from a man who had lived with a very specific regret. I spent evenings at Delia's kitchen table going through those boxes and slowly assembling a picture of a person I had never known and would never get to meet. Edward had not been a particularly warm man by his own account in the journals. He had been driven and exacting and not always easy to live with. His marriage had ended when his son Daniel was young. He and Daniel had a complicated, painful relationship for decades, one built on distance and unspoken things and the particular damage that passes between fathers and sons who cannot find a common language. When Daniel died, Edward had found the letter. In the letter, Daniel had written about me. He had written that he had a daughter he had not been part of raising and that this was the thing he regretted most in his life. He had written my name. He had written the name of the city in Ohio where my mother had raised me. He had written that he was sorry he had not been better. Edward had wept over that letter. I know because he wrote about it in his journal. He wrote that reading it was the first time he had cried since his own mother's death 40 years before. He wrote that he had spent too much of his life not going toward things and that he wanted to spend whatever time he had left trying to correct that, even if it was too late to correct it fully. He spent the next 6 years looking for me. He did not find me in time. But he made sure that if anyone ever did find me, I would know that he had tried. I sat with one of his journals for a long time one night and I thought about inheritance. Not the legal kind, the emotional kind. The way absence passes through generations and lands in people who did not ask for it and do not always know what to do with it. My father had been absent. His father had been emotionally absent in different ways, and somehow that chain of distance had come around and landed in my lap in the form of both a wound and a repair all at once. I wrote Edward a letter. I know he would never read it. I wrote it anyway. I told him I was sorry we did not have more time. I told him I had read his journals and that I understood he had tried. I told him his granddaughter turned out all right despite everything, and that she was going to take care of the things he had left behind. About 2 months after I came home from the hospital, I was well enough to travel. Margaret had handled the final divorce paperwork. Charles was guiding me through the probate process. The $400,000 liquid portion of the estate had been formally released to me and was sitting in an account with my name on it, which was still a reality I had to remind myself of regularly because it felt like information that belonged to someone else's life. I went to Boston. The house Edward had left was a narrow, well-maintained brownstone in a quiet neighborhood with a small garden in the back that someone had clearly tended carefully until recently. Charles had arranged for a caretaker to look after it during the estate process. I stood on the front step the first time with my hands in my coat pockets and looked at the dark green door and thought that I had no map for this. I did not know how to inherit a life. I did not know how to walk into rooms that belonged to a grandfather I had never known and decide what to do with them. But I also knew that uncertainty had never actually stopped me from doing things that needed to be done. So I put my hand on the door handle and I went in. The house was quiet and clean and full of the particular stillness of places that have not had a person living in them for a while. There were books everywhere. Shelves covering nearly every wall in the main rooms, organized with a precision that told me something about who Edward had been without requiring any additional explanation. There were framed photographs, some of people I recognized from the journals, some I did not. On a small table in the hallway, there was a single framed photograph I had not expected. It was of a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with light brown hair and a very serious expression. I stood in front of it for a long time before I realized I was looking at my mother. Somehow Edward had found a photograph of my mother from a time before any of the damage. She looked exactly as I had looked at that age. The resemblance was so clear it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. I sat down on the floor of my grandfather's hallway and I held the photograph and I gave myself a few minutes to feel everything I had been keeping at arm's length for weeks. The surgery, the empty room, the envelope, the divorce, the call from Gloria with her rearranged warmth, Raymond's calculated concern, the boxes of journals, the letter Daniel had written about me before he died, my mother's face at 4 years old in a frame on a dead man's table, all of it. I let it all arrive at once and I sat with it until it passed into something quieter. Then I stood up, set the photograph carefully back on the table, and started making a list of what needed to be done. Back in Ohio, the news about the inheritance had spread through the social circles I shared with Marcus in ways that were both predictable and instructive. People who had been politely distant during the marriage began reaching out. People who had accepted Marcus's framing of our separation without question began to ask different questions. Two of Marcus's cousins, whom I had genuinely liked during the marriage and who had been conspicuously quiet after the divorce filing, Sent messages saying they hoped I was recovering and that they wanted me to know they had always thought highly of me. Marcus's former college friend, a man named Brett who had been at our wedding and whom Marcus had described to me as his closest friend, sent a LinkedIn message asking if we could connect professionally. The professional connection he was hoping for involved investment properties in New England. I declined without explaining myself. Gloria made one more phone call. This one came about 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. She opened differently this time without the warmth of the earlier call. She said she wanted me to understand that whatever had happened between Marcus and me, she considered herself a person of integrity and she did not want our relationship to become adversarial. I said I had no interest in anything adversarial. She said she hoped that extended to the estate matters and that she hoped I understood the importance of keeping family in mind when making decisions about significant assets. I asked her which family she was referring to, given that the estate had come to me through my own biological family and not through Marcus's. She paused for longer than was comfortable. She said she meant family broadly. I said I appreciated that and that my attorney was handling everything and that I wished Marcus well. Then I ended the call again. It was the last call I received from Gloria. The probate process took several months to fully conclude, which is normal for estates of that size and complexity. During those months, I made several decisions that changed the shape of my life in ways that would have been impossible to imagine from the hospital bed where this story really begins. The first decision was to transfer back to the Boston area. I had no particular reason to remain in Ohio after the divorce. My job, which I genuinely loved, had a regional affiliate organization in Massachusetts that had been looking for experienced program leadership. Margaret had connected me with a colleague who knew the director of that organization, and after 3 conversations, I had a job offer that was a step up from what I had been doing and would allow me to keep doing work that actually mattered to me. I accepted it. The second decision was about the brownstone. I spent time in it during the probate months, going up for long weekends, getting to know the space and the neighborhood and the particular light in the garden in the early morning. I began to understand that I did not want to sell it. It was the only physical thing I had that connected me to Edward, to my father, to the line of my own family that had been invisible to me for 37 years. Selling it would have felt like folding the letter back and putting it away again. I decided to keep it. I would live there. It would be mine in a way that nothing in my marriage had ever been mine. The third decision was about how I would handle the money, not recklessly, not in a way that performed wealth or demanded recognition, but in a way that reflected the values I had carried for years while people around me treated those values as charming but unserious. I made a significant donation to the nonprofit where I had worked in Ohio, specifically to a fund I had tried and failed for 2 years to get fully established for community health access. I funded it fully myself. I told no one outside of Charles and Margaret and Delia. The program director at my former organization called me in tears. She said she had never seen a donor act so quickly or so quietly, and she wanted me to know what it would mean. I said I knew exactly what it would mean, and that was why I had done it. Delia came to help me move into the brownstone. We spent a weekend unpacking boxes and deciding what to keep from Edward's belongings and what to carefully and respectfully pass on. We kept the books. We kept the journals. We kept the photographs, including the one of my mother in the hallway, which I moved to the mantel in the front room where I would see it. Every day, we rearranged the furniture and bought new kitchen things and planted something in the back garden that I was told by the caretaker would bloom in the spring. By the end of that weekend, the house felt less like a place I had inherited and more like a place I lived. That distinction mattered more than I can explain. On the last evening of that weekend, Delia and I sat in the back garden with 2 glasses of wine as the light went low and the neighborhood quieted around us, and I thought about what I wanted to say about everything that had happened. I had been careful with my words during all of the legal and logistical months. I had been deliberate and measured, and I had said what needed to be said in rooms that required precision. But sitting in my own garden with my oldest friend, I finally just let myself speak without structure. I said that the hardest part was not the betrayal. The hardest part was the years before the betrayal when I had been training myself to accept less than I deserved and calling it love. The betrayal was the end of a process, not the beginning of one. Marcus leaving that envelope was the final act of a pattern that had been running for 3 years. The surgery just made it impossible to hide from anymore, and in a terrible and very specific way, I was grateful for that, not for the surgery. Not for the pain, but for the impossibility of going back to being the person who stayed quiet in rooms where she should have been heard. Delia said, "You know what I kept thinking when you were in the hospital?" I said no. She said, "I kept thinking she works so hard for people who are barely paying attention, and I wanted to grab all of them and make them understand what they were looking at." She paused. "I think maybe now they understand." I thought about Marcus's family. I thought about Gloria's rearranged warmth and Raymond's calculated concern and the cousins who came back around when the wind shifted. I thought about Brett's LinkedIn message and the way opportunity changes who people remember to care about. I did not feel angry. I had been angry in the quiet, compressed way that people carry anger when they have not had time to put it somewhere useful. But in that garden, in that October light, the anger had mostly become something else, something closer to clarity, a very specific understanding of what I had been, what I had allowed, and what I was not going to allow again. I thought also about Edward, about a man who had spent the last years of his life trying to correct a long absence and had not quite made it in time. About my father, who had written a letter at the end of his life that became the map to a granddaughter who had not known she was lost. About my mother, who had raised me alone with extraordinary care and had never once suggested that I should expect less than full love and full respect, even though by the time I was an adult I had somehow convinced myself that partial love was the only kind available to me. These people were all connected to me in ways I had not known. The shape of my inheritance was not just financial. It was a longer story than I had understood. The spring came, the thing in the garden bloomed, and it turned out to be a cluster of deep purple flowers that the caretaker told me Edward had planted himself every year for decades. I sent Charles a photograph. He said Edward had loved that garden and that seeing it in bloom again meant something. I thought that was exactly right. In the months since I had moved to Boston and started my new job and settled into the brownstone, something kept shifting in me in a direction I had not anticipated. I had expected to feel relief, which I did. I had expected to feel the particular pride that comes from surviving something significant, but I had not expected to feel, gradually and then more consistently, like myself. Not the myself I had been in my marriage, which had been a version of me organized around someone else's comfort, not the exhausted myself of the hospital bed, but an older and more foundational myself, the self that had existed before I had learned to make myself convenient, the self that my mother had known, the self that apparently Edward had hoped to find. I rebuilt some things and let other things stay gone. I kept my work, which gave me purpose and grounded me in something that was genuinely useful. I kept Delia, who called twice a week and visited every couple of months and remained exactly who she had always been. I made new friends through the Boston affiliate program, people who knew me only as Nadia Voss, not as Marcus's wife, not as the woman who had come into money, not as the inheritor of anything. Just as the person who ran the health access programs and brought very strong coffee to every morning meeting and had a good eye for which community proposals were going to actually work. I did not date right away, I was not ready, but I was not afraid of the idea, which felt like significant progress from where I had been. The difference between being afraid of something and simply not being ready for it is important. Being afraid means you have let the past convince you that the future will repeat it. Not being ready means you trust yourself enough to wait until you are. I waited. Marcus and I had no more contact after the legal matters concluded. I heard through peripheral connections that he had moved to a different city and was working with a new firm. I hope he is doing well in the ways that matter. I mean that without bitterness and without particular warmth. He is simply someone who used to be in my life. The chapter closed. I went to see a grief counselor about 8 months after the surgery. Not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted to talk through the accumulated weight of everything in a space designed for that purpose. My counselor was a steady, thoughtful woman who had clearly heard a great deal of human complexity in her career and who never once suggested that my emotions were disproportionate or that I should move on faster than I was moving. We talked about my mother. We talked about my father's letter and what it meant to grieve someone you had never known. We talked about the marriage and what it had cost me before I had fully understood the price. We talked about the surgery and the specific terror of waking up alone and the specific grace of Delia arriving the next morning with that absolute determination. It was useful in the way that honest conversation always is. It did not fix anything that had been broken. It helped me understand what had been broken well enough to decide what I wanted to rebuild and what I was willing to leave behind. There was one moment, in the winter of my first full year in Boston, that I want to tell you about because it was the moment I felt the story fully close. I had gone to a formal dinner hosted by a Boston philanthropy organization that was honoring a list of donors who had made significant anonymous contributions to community programs in the past year. Charles had quietly put my name forward, without my knowledge, as someone the organization might want to recognize. I had not known about it until I received the invitation, at which point I called him and asked him what he thought he was doing, and he laughed in a way that was the most human I had ever heard him, and said that Edward would have done the same thing in his place. The dinner was at a large historic building downtown with high ceilings and good lighting and the kind of crowd that was genuinely interested in the work being done rather than primarily interested in being seen doing it, which made it easier to breathe. I sat at a round table with several other honorees and their guests. One of the other people at my table was a woman named Simone, who ran a housing stability program in Dorchester that I had already read about in the course of my own work. We talked for the entire first course and most of the second and exchanged cards and made plans to visit each other's programs. She became someone I now consider a genuine friend and ally. This is how good things grow, not all at once, but consistently if you put yourself in rooms where the right things are happening. Toward the end of the dinner, there was a brief recognition ceremony. Each honoree was acknowledged and their contribution described in general terms without personal financial specifics. When they got to my name and mentioned the Health Access Fund in Ohio that had been fully established, there was a response in the room that I was not entirely prepared for. Not applause alone, but a kind of attention, a genuine, respectful attention that had nothing to do with who I was married to or what family I had come from or how I looked in the right dress for the right event. It was attention for something I had actually done, something I had chosen, something no one had talked me into or away from. I sat with that feeling for a moment before I smiled and nodded and let the evening move on, but I filed it somewhere important, the feeling of being seen for something real. On the walk home from that dinner, it was cold and clear and the streets were mostly quiet. I stopped for a moment outside my building and looked up at the lit windows of the brownstone and thought about all the nights Edward had looked at those same windows from the other direction, coming home to that house, carrying whatever he carried from a life that had been both successful and full of the particular regrets of a man who had not always gone toward things. I thought about him deciding in the last years of his life that going toward something was still possible, that it was worth trying, that the granddaughter he had never met was worth looking for even if he might not find her in time. He did not find me in time, but he left a door open and someone else walked through it on his behalf, and that door had changed my life in ways tha. Tea still on quiet nights catch me off guard with their scale. I went inside, I made tea. I sat in the front room under the warm light with Edward's books around me and my mother's photograph on the mantel and the knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not because the world had arranged itself to reward me, not because everything had resolved neatly, but because I had survived the things that were meant to diminish me and I had refused in the end to be diminished. I thought about the envelope in the hospital, the 9 sentences, the way Marcus's handwriting had looked careful and small on that note, the handwriting of someone who had thought about the words for a long time but not long enough. I thought about Gloria's recalculated warmth and Raymond's transparent concern and Brett's LinkedIn message and all the ways that people reveal themselves when the ground shifts under their calculations. I thought about Delia on the train from Philadelphia because she knew before I did that something was wrong. I thought about Charles Whitmore walking into my hospital room with silver hair and a leather briefcase and 3 years of searching and the name I was born with. The ground had shifted, and I had moved with it not away from anything but toward something, toward myself, toward the truth of what I was worth and what I deserved and who I was without someone else's frame around me. The heart that had required surgery to continue beating was still beating. The woman who had woken up in an empty room was no longer trying to fill emptiness with the wrong things. That is how the story goes when you decide to stop running from it, not perfectly, not without cost, but forward honestly with your own name. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to take a moment with it honestly. Has there ever been someone in your life who only came back around when something changed in your circumstances? Someone whose warmth reappeared at a very convenient time? Drop your story in the comments because I genuinely want to know how you handled it. And if you have ever been in a position where you had to choose between keeping the peace and choosing yourself, tell me what you decided. This community is built on those real, honest answers. Nadia's story continues, and so does yours.